Often what passes for love is either merely mawkish sentimentality, or else it's neediness, which very quickly turns into anger when the object of my love doesn't reciprocate. And so in order to be able to love really, you first have to be awake. And so when you look at the great Hindu articulation of Trinity, Sat, Chit, Ananda, it means being, knowing the self, and then loving what you find. And so you can't love until you're fully aware. And that's why I've chosen 3 very short readings today from 3 great avatars. Gautama Siddhartha, who flourished between 564 BCE, before the Common Era, and 480 BCE. And then Socrates, who was born in 470 BCE and died in 399 BCE. And finally, Jesus Christ, who died about 6 BCE and died around 30 CE. And I sometimes think that they may actually be reincarnations of the same soul. Firstly, coming into the extraordinary Hindu culture, and then into the Greek culture, and then into the Hebrew culture. So I've taken just one line from each of these great teachers that represent what it means to be fully awake. From the Buddha, he said famously, "I am Buddha," which literally means, in Sanskrit, "I am awake." It was a nickname he gave to himself, or a vocation he gave to himself. Socrates said famously, as he was about to be killed, poisoned for disturbing the peace, he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And then Jesus finally said, "Understand this. If the homeowner knew exactly when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and not permit his house to be broken into." These are words inspired by God. Everybody has an internal GPS system which dictates how we think, how we speak, how we act. Otherwise, we'd simply be kind of like catatonic zombies. So there's some deep, deep wisdom that's driving our lifestyles. The problem is that this GPS system, or this internalized philosophy of life, has been unconsciously acquired. And in any one situation in which we find ourselves, it is unconsciously accessed. So we got it from our parents, or teachers, or school, or wherever, and we were totally unaware of what we were taking aboard. And so now we respond unconsciously by what we think, what we speak, and how we act in particular situations. And that was the genius of great avatars like Socrates and Buddha and Jesus, realizing that the first stage of the journey back to God is not love, actually. Because as I said in the readings I've chosen, you can't really love until you're fully aware, until you're acting from your soul self. Then what appears to be love is just mawkish sentimentality for family members, perhaps, or a kind of a neediness. You love somebody until they let you down, and then your love turns to anger or hatred, meaning it wasn't love to begin with. It was simply some kind of an addiction. They were satisfying some need that you had. And therefore, you have to be awake before you can actually love. And that's exactly what Socrates is saying, what the Buddha is saying, and what Jesus is saying. And so for the month of March, I've chosen to look again once more at the notion of creating your own personal cosmology, consciously bringing to life that which drives your behavior. And I suggested many times to you that as you try to construct a personal cosmology, there are 4 basic questions that kind of create the skeleton around which you can build the rest of your cosmology. And there are 4 questions. And the first question to ask is, who is God? When I think of God, what do I mean by God? Is it a kind of a long bearded guy sitting in the sky, at commandments and a punishing rod? Or what do I mean when I say God? And when I say I, every statement I make that starts with an I, what is that I representing? Who am I actually? What is the real self? That's the second great question. And the third question is, what do I mean by neighbor? Is neighbor the guy at the other side of the white picket fence, or the same tribe as me, or the guy who believes the same things that I believe? Or what do I mean when I say neighbor? And then fourthly, what is my mission, or what is my purpose? Am I here just by accident, the accidental meeting of a sperm with an egg, and bingo, here I am? Or is there purpose, for my reason for being here? And so I'll divide this up then into this Sunday with God's help and next Sunday. And then on the fourth Sunday, because the third Sunday we'll be doing the retreat, on the fourth Sunday, I'll do a recap of these things. So today I'm going to set the stage of what I mean by a personal cosmology. And I'll deal just with the first question, the God question, who is God? And the next Sunday, God willing, I look at the other three questions. What do we mean by I? What do I mean by neighbor? And what do I mean by purpose or mission? So to begin with, just a quick kind of a synopsis of the topic. In the last book I wrote, I created this kind of an image. I said, imagine that you have a little child in the house, a 4-year-old boy, who's getting into everything. And you've just bought this beautiful jigsaw puzzle, 5,000 pieces, and it's on the table in the dining room. And you're out in the backyard working in the garden, and your son finds it, opens it up, and he scatters all the 5,000 pieces all over the house. Some in the bathroom, some in the kitchen, some in the dining room. And to make matters worse, he's playing with the dog, and the dog has found a cornflakes box and has ripped it to shreds. And now there are pieces of the cornflakes box mixed in with the jigsaw puzzle pieces. And that's the situation you experience when you come back in from working in the garden. Now, what do you need to do at this stage? There's 3 things you have to do. The first thing is you have to gather up all the pieces, hunt in all the rooms to try to find out where all of the pieces are scattered. And that basically in philosophy is called epistemology. Epistemology about gathering all the pieces together, gathering all the information together that will ultimately create your personal cosmology. So you gather all the pieces together. But now there's jigsaw puzzle pieces and there are cornflakes box pieces all mixed in together. And from the back, they look the same. They're just, black cardboard, brown cardboard. So the second thing you have to do is, once you've gathered all the pieces you can find, you have to sort them out into the real jigsaw puzzle pieces and then the cornflakes box pieces and get rid of those. And in philosophy, we call that ontology. Ontology is figuring out being or truth. What is true? Of all the data I've collected, what data are true and what data are false? And then the third piece is, now that you've figured out, what the real pieces are, now you start, creating the jigsaw puzzle. And in philosophy, that's called cosmology, putting together all the real pieces, the truthful pieces, and creating a model of life out of them. Now, to go into a little bit more detail, epistemology then, knowing how do we know what we know? How do we gather up all of the data? And there are basically 3 ways that we know what we know. The first one is that some authority figure told us. And so, for instance, some school teacher told you that Mount Everest was 29,029 feet high. Now, you couldn't have figured that out on your own. So somebody had to tell you, and you believed them because it was a school teacher that told you. Or you read it in a book that told you. So that's the first way we know things. An authority figure told us. The second way in which we know things is that we experience something for ourselves. And only experience can deliver that particular kind of data. For instance, what is the taste of an orange? Nobody can explain to you what the taste of an orange is like. You got to bite into an orange yourself and feel it for yourself. No matter how they try to explain it to you, there's no substitute for actually biting into an orange and tasting it for yourself. So that's the second kind of way in which we know. We know because we've experienced something for ourselves. And then the third place where we know what we know is that we figure stuff out for ourselves. Maybe you're a brilliant mathematician and you've come up with a brand new algorithm, but you figured this out for yourself. Nobody told you how to do it. So there would be the 3 ways then, epistemologically, that we gather the truth. Now we've got all this data inside in us. The next problem then is ontology. How do we know that those data are true or false? We have to make some kind of a discernment. So we have to, faced with any kind of proposition, I have to ask myself, do I believe this to be true or do I think it's not true? Now, Thomas Aquinas very famously said, truth is found only in the judgment. It's only when you make a discernment about the data that you can find truth. And he's using truth here with a little t, a little truth. And so faced with any proposition, somebody proposes any kind of thing to you, you have to figure out, do you believe that or are you going to reject that? And there is no such thing as a self-evident truth. If there were a self-evident truth, then there would be no possibility for disputing it. But the problem is we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. We see it from a very, very biased perspective. Now, and so this idea of figuring out, is it true or is it not true? This can be done consciously or it can be done unconsciously. And very often has to do with who told me. I'll believe it if an expert told me. I won't believe it if somebody who's not an expert told me. Or I have a particular perspective, and anybody who tells me something which is in agreement with that perspective, I'll believe them. But if somebody has a different perspective, what they tell me, I probably won't believe. So it depends on who told me, and does it accord with my previous belief system? If it does, it's much easier to say, oh yeah, that must be true. If it's not, I can reject it very, very quickly. Now, many times I've defined for you what truth really means, in my opinion, that something is true only if it transforms me and aligns me with love. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with love. And I've said to you that something can be true, but not factual, and something can be factual, but not true. So for instance, the stock exchange, the Dow Jones today, whatever the number it is, that's a fact. Is it life transforming? Are you suddenly catapulted into the heavenly realms by that knowledge? Obviously not. So it's not transforming. So it's factual, but it's not true. But you take the story of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus talks about, a priest and a Levite ignoring a man who'd been beaten up and left for dead at the side of the road, even though he was a landsman, he was a fellow Jew, and an enemy comes up, Samaritan, picks him up and attends to him. Now, was that a factual story? It may not have been. It may have been just a parable that Jesus made up on the spot when he was asked to talk about who my neighbor is. So it may not even have been factual, but was it true? Absolutely true. Because anybody who really heard that story was utterly transformed. Their idea of what a neighbor was and what love was radically transformed. So that's the second part then, the ontological question. How do we decide what's true and what's not true? So now I've gathered up all the pieces. I've decided what's the cornflakes box pieces and thrown them away, and I've kept what I believe to be true. Now, how do I organize those into a meaningful picture? So now I have to organize these truths and belief systems into a coherent and consistent system, which must be able to contain and explain all of my past experiences and also all of my future experiences. If it's a good cosmology, it should be able to embrace all data, whether it's data from the past, data from the present, or data from the future. Now, as I said, the problem is this cosmology very, very often, has been programmed at an unconscious level and is accessed at an unconscious level. And so the cosmological piece then has to make sure that we break out of this prison, where we've been programmed by others, and develop it for oneself. So now you're going to set about radically examining your own personal cosmology. What are some of the parameters? What must it be and what must it do? The first thing to realize is that a personal cosmology is much, much bigger than mere ethics or religion. It's not just figuring out a bunch of commandments by which you're going to live, or dogmatic decrees that you're going to say yes to. So it must be much bigger than ethics or religion. It must explain mysticism. It must explain what life really is for you, life before incarnation, life during incarnation, and life after incarnation, and reincarnation, if you subscribe to that. So an adequate personal cosmology must be able to do all of these things for you. It should be able enable you to deal with a whole bunch of other topics, like the existence of extraterrestrials or extradimensionals or angels or demons. Not necessarily you have to believe this, but you have to figure out, do they exist? Are they real? Where do they fit into my belief system? And as I say, the skeleton of this entire model is the answer to these four questions: who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? So now you have some idea what the cosmology is, and you're going to create your own personal version of it. So what are some of the stages in that process? So I remember during my time in Kenya, I lived in missions. We didn't have electricity. We had we generated ourselves. We had big generators, and during the night hours, for 3 or 4 hours in the evening time, we'd fire up the generator, and then there'd be light on the compound. And so there was I lived right on the equator, so I literally had 12 hours darkness and 12 hours daylight. So being Irish, there was no way I could go to bed at 6 p.m. in the evening when the sun went down. Although the whole, the village would go to bed. There's no way I could go to bed at 6 o'clock in the evening. And so typically it'd be like 11 p.m. before I got to bed. So how did I while away the hours when there was no light? I'm, reading by candlelight. So what I did was I did a kind of a spiritual archaeology on my own Catholic faith. I'd been brought up Catholic from the time I was literally born. I'd been kind of exposed to my great-grandmother, who was a mystic. I'd been exposed to my grandfather, who was a druid. And I was exposed to 8 years of seminary training where I was inducted into the Catholic priesthood and Catholic theology. And so now my father's an archaeologist, so I began digging down into this cultural belief system of myself to try to figure out, could I differentiate just cultural artifacts from real transcendent reality? So one by one, I started examining all of the creedal formulation that were part of my cosmology to then. And I would examine each item and then either accept it or reject it. So in my mind, I had two different buckets, the rejection bucket and the acceptance bucket. And so what I was trying to do, to quote somebody, I don't remember who actually said it, but it's a beautiful phrase. I was trying to hospice the old cosmology and midwife the new cosmology. That's what I spent many, many years in Kenya doing. And so I give you a few kind of typical examples of that. I looked at the notion of papal infallibility. Did I really believe that there's some man in Rome sitting on a chair who, when he speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith and moral to be held by all the faithful, is radically infallible? And I asked myself, how come it took 1,870 years for the papacy to figure out that the Pope was infallible? It only happened in the First Vatican Council in 1870 and 1871. So I rejected papal infallibility. There is no such thing as papal infallibility as far as I'm concerned. That went into the rejection bucket. Another thing I looked at was the notion of birth control, that somehow every act of romantic love has to be open to the possibility of the patter of tiny feet. And I'm looking at a situation, for instance, in the Catholic Church, where in Africa, Kenyan women at that stage had the highest birth rate in the world, 8.5 kids per woman, typically. And so that this idea that we just have to keep breeding, that every time a couple makes love, they have to be open to the possibility they're going to have to feed another mouth. That didn't make any sense whatsoever to me. And so I rejected that piece. Another one was the notion that women can't be priests because the disciples of Jesus were all men. A ludicrous notion. If you look at the Last Supper, it was prepared by women, and women were present to it. When Jesus said, "Do this in memory of me," whenever you did this, you're actually being priests. There were women priests at that Last Supper as well as there were male priests there. So the idea that women can't be priests because of gender issues didn't make any sense whatsoever to me. So that went into the rejection bucket. I looked at the notions of limbo, that there are some little babies who are born, but they have original sin imprinted on their souls. They've never even breathed, they died as soon as they were born. They've never committed a sin, so they can't go to hell because they haven't sinned, but they can't go to heaven because there's this stain of original sin on their souls. So they wind up in this place called limbo. Such mishigas, total ridiculous. So I rejected that. Or the idea of purgatory, that God creates this fire where he's going to really torture souls, until he's got his pound of flesh, and then they're allowed into heaven. Or the notion of hell, that there's any soul which is a fractal of God that can be consigned for all eternity to be separated from the source. That totally did not make sense to me. So these were the stuff that I threw into the rejection bucket. I looked at stuff like the golden rule, as you would, that men should do to you, do you also to them in like manner. And as I studied, I found that this very same statement is found in all of the great religious traditions of the world. Jesus did not invent this. This came again and again and again throughout human history. And so I felt the golden rule, yes, that's a keeper. They put that into the keeper bucket. Or the notion of forgiving the enemy, that goes into the keeper bucket. So one by one, I started taking all of these precepts that were part of the the scaffolding of my existing cosmology and deciding whether to keep them or whether to reject them. And then start building a brand new cosmology around the ones that I felt were useful. So they were kind of the stages that I personally went through. I began to look then at this notion of, when we try to speak about God, obviously we're trying to deal with an utterly transcendent mystery that can be experienced but it can never be comprehended. And so if you have a mystical experience, and to put it more correctly, you can't actually have a mystical experience. You can be had by a mystical experience, but you are not creating it. Your individuality is not creating this experience. It is the totality which is affording the separated soul the possibility of unity consciousness for a brief period of time. So you're in the grips of a mystical experience. So that's stage one. Now, when the mystical experience ends, you're left with some kind of a symbolic residue. There's some kind of a symbol that lurks in your psyche, reminding you of where you've just been. That's stage two. The third stage then is you try to conceptualize and put words to what that symbol might mean. And the fourth stage is you erect a whole bunch of concepts and you create a kind of a theology or a philosophy to try to explain the mystical experience. And of course, you can't do it. Now you're 3 stages away from the actual experience itself. And our very language picks up on that issue. And so there are many kinds of God language. The first kind is what's called in Greek cataphatic language. And cataphatic language is the language of theologians who are trying to articulate and tell you who God is and what God had for breakfast, and are prepared to go to war to defend, their kind of a fine-tuning. The great split in the Christian church happened in 1054. There was a split between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Roman Christianity on the basis of a single Latin word, filioque, which is translated into English as and of the Son. So there's this big dispute where they're trying to figure out the Holy Trinity, as if you could figure out the Holy Trinity. And so they came up with this creedal formulation that said, the Father is uncreated and unbegotten. The Son is uncreated, but he's begotten of the Father. And the Spirit is uncreated and is begotten of the Father and of the Son, filioque. The Eastern Church disagreed and said the Spirit is uncreated but begotten of both, only of the Father, not of the Father and the Son. And they went to war and they decimated each other for up until the 1900s, when Pope John the 23rd finally reconciled with the Greek Orthodox Church. So that's cataphatic language. That's where that gets us, when we try to nail down who God is. So there's a whole other language, which in Greek is called apophatic. And this is the language of the mystics of all cultures. So Lao Tzu famously opined, those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. So that's apophatic language. Hinduism has this great phrase, neti neti, not this, not that. So you can't actually say what God is. You can just back into the experience, but you can't articulate it. The same way the Zen koan does the very same thing. The Zen koan is inviting us out of the intellect, out of cataphatic language. It's offering stuff like, what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? Or what is the sound of one hand clapping? There's no rational answer to these questions. And the object of the exercise is to get you out of your mind and away from a cataphatic language into apophatic language. Meister Eckhart would say famously, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. I'm praying to ultimate reality so I can get rid of this kind of excuse of God that I've created in my theology. And Gautama Siddhartha would say very famously, his followers finally, when they understood his message, they would say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, if you think you've confined the teachings of the Buddha to a theology, you're kind of fooling yourself. So that's the second kind of language. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, there's a third kind of language, which is the language of parable, metaphor, and story. If you're a teacher like Jesus was, now you have to try to articulate the experiences of the divine in some kind of a teachable format. But you can't do that in theology, and you can't do it in philosophy, and you can't do it in science. You can only do it in a parabolic form, in a metaphorical form, in an allegorical form, in a story form, or with proverb form. That's the only way that you can kind of capture the essence of that mystical teaching, which is why Jesus insisted on speaking only in stories and in parables. So you see then how the language has changed and affected, our personal cosmology. So now I want to look at what I consider to be the evolution of our notions of God, because it's changed radically over the years. So Homo sapiens evolved about 200,000 years ago, thinking human beings. So they could think, but they could not think about thinking. In order to think about thinking, you need language. And they didn't have language at that stage. That only came 130,000 years later, about 7,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens sapiens developed. People who could think about thinking. And now we began to wrestle with the great existential issues. Where do we come from? Who invented all of this? Where do we go when we die? And at this stage now, we began to invent gods. And we invented, I believe, 3 different kinds of divinities. The first one I would call regional gods. So there were gods who had a jurisdiction over particular parts of, regional areas of the world. I would call them the local mafia god, the god who was in charge of a particular geographical area. And if you moved into his area, you had to worship him, or else he would extort a price from you. So these were regional gods that were settled in particular pieces of real estate somewhere on planet Earth. They were the first kind of gods. The second kind of gods I would call tribal gods. So these were gods who kind of allied themselves to particular nomadic tribes. And if the tribe wandered around, these gods wandered around with them. And then you got problems, because when the tribal gods encountered the regional gods, then you had warfare. You had bloodshed of all kinds, as the denizens of these 2 systems made war with each other. So they're tribal divinities who march around with their chosen people or their chosen tribe. And then thirdly, you have what I would call portfolio gods. So if you're interested in war, Mars is the god you need to follow. If you're interested in art, you need a different god. If you're interested in sexuality, you need a third kind of god. If you're interested in agriculture, you need a different kind of god. So I would call these portfolio gods. So they specialize in particular arenas. And if you're interested in that particular area, that's the god you needed to follow. And I think historically, there were 4 great stages to this process as we kind of wrestled with our notions of the divine. I would say maybe 4 or 5 great stages. And the first stage I would call the era of the theologians. It's when we were talking about the gods. We had no experiences of them yet, but we were trying to figure out, somebody must have created all of this. Who are they? And what are they like? So we're talking about the gods. We haven't met them yet. That would be, I would call it, the era of the theologians. And then came the era of the priests. Now they think they've figured out who the gods are and what the gods want. And now they're attempting to talk to the gods. So they invent prayer, and they invent ritual, and they invent sacrifices in order to placate these gods and ask the God intercede for us, against our enemies. That would be the second great stage or era, I believe. Then came what I call the era of the prophets, particular individuals who purported to speak on behalf of their God. And so their job was to kind of go up onto the top of a mountain, experience a theophany, get commandments from God and bring them back down to the rest of us and say, God said this. And then we began to follow. So that would be the kind of the next stage, the prophets. And then the fourth stage would be the mystics. And the mystics are not talking about the gods. They're not talking to the gods. They're not talking they're not talking on behalf of the gods. They're talking as God. Because only the mystic realizes that only God exists, and that everything that we experience is simply a holographic fractal of source. And so Jesus can say, I am, because Jesus is identified with his own divinity. And he would say the same things I do, you can do. I am in the Father, and you are in me. And so therefore you are in the Father. There is nothing which is not in the Father. There is nothing which is not God. As I've said kind of facetiously many times, everything that exists is simply God in drag. And so the mystics speak as God. And then I'd say actually there's a fifth category. I call them they're called the non-dual mystics. And these are people who do not speak about the gods. They don't speak to the gods. They don't speak on behalf of the gods. And they don't even speak as God. They keep their mouth shut because they realize that anything you say about God is kind of just totally made up. So what are some of the things that we've made up about God? So I remember years ago, a distraught mother of a teenage son who the son had decided he wasn't going to go to church anymore. And she dragged him into my psychology office so that I could straighten him out and prove to him that God exists. So the three of us are sitting inside in the room, and I said to the kid, tell me who's this God that you don't believe in? And he began to tell me about, this particular God. And at the end of about 10 minutes, I said to him, you know what? The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. And then we had some place to begin. So, once we get rid of the God that I don't believe in, he didn't believe in, there was a place for us all to go forward, and make some real contact. So who is the God that I do not believe in? I do not believe that God is the dysfunctional parent who threw Adam and Eve out of the garden because they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. No part of me believes that. Literally, there's a deep mystical truth in the story and the parable, but it is not a literal thing that God got angry with them. He said, don't eat from that tree. They did, and he fired their asses out of the garden. I do not believe that God is this kind of a dysfunctional parent. If he were, as a California psychologist, I'd be mandated to report him to the Child Protective Services. So I don't believe in that God. Nor do I believe in a cosmic psychopath who wiped out all of creation in a flood. Because he was so upset with human beings that he killed everybody on the planet except 8 people, Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and the wives of the sons. I don't believe that God is a cosmic psychopath. And I devoted an entire book. The last book I wrote, Setting God Free, is dedicated to showing you why I don't believe in that God. Next, I do not believe that that God is partisan. There is no such thing as a chosen race. There is no such thing as one true religion. When the Catholic Church avers extra ecclesiam nulla est salus, outside of the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. That's totally made up, absolutely made up. There's no way I can believe in a chosen race or a chosen religion. I don't even think that there's a chosen planet. I can't believe for the life of me that God, who's peering down through trillions of parallel universes, has a particular love affair with this universe of ours. And in this universe of ours, which has literally trillions of trillions of galaxies, that he picks out one galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, and said, I love that Milky Way galaxy particularly. And then of all the solar systems in that Milky Way galaxy, he picks out one particular solar system, and he says, I love that solar system particularly. And there's 9 planets whirling around that. And he says, but I really love this particular planet called planet Earth. And of all the people on the planet, I love this particular tribe best, or I love this particular religion best. This is total mishigas. And so God is not partisan in any way. Now, I don't even believe that God is a creator. That God goes into his laboratory some morning and says, today I think I'm going to create elephants. And then tomorrow he figures out, today I'm going to create mosquitoes. And then the next day he says, I'm going to create human beings. I do not believe in this notion of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Rather, with Plotinus, I believe that it is emanatio ab Deo. It is emanation from God. That, life emanates from the source. They're not discrete, separate acts whereby God calls into being that which did not previously exist in potentia. Everything that exists is literally a manifestation and an emanation from the loving heart of God. So I don't believe in a creator God. Nor do I believe that God is a lawmaker, a lawgiver, a law enforcer, and a law punisher. There are cosmic rules, obviously, that are how the universe operates, but the fact that the idea that God came down with a whole bunch of commandments and said, if you don't keep this, here's the punishment that you're going to experience. So this idea of God as a lawmaker, a lawgiver, a law enforcer, and a law punisher, that is not the God that I believe in. And finally, I do not believe that God is a person. Now, here's the thing. God is not a person, but I am a person. And so I can only have a personal relationship with God. And I've used this example many times. I live in the middle of the forest. I trek in the forest on a regular basis. I have a personal relationship with the forest, but the forest isn't the person. But I'm a person, and therefore the only relationship I can have with anything is a personal relationship. And so, of course, you have a personal relationship with God, but that doesn't make God a person. And certainly it doesn't make God 3 persons. The idea that there's a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit, 3 discrete entities. One guy with a long beard, the other guy with holes in his hands, and the other guy who's a dove, a pigeon. I don't believe in that. That happened because of the word prosopon in Greek, when they talked about experiencing God as prosopon. Prosopon means the mask that an actor wears when he comes on stage in order to clue the audience in as to what kind of a character he's going to portray. So if the actor comes out with a mask that looks like this, it's going to be a comedy. If he comes out with a mask that looks like this, it's going to be a tragedy. So prosopon meant the mask the actor is wearing in order to clue the audience in as to what character he's playing. So when we talk about the persons of the Trinity, we're talking about the ways in which we experience God. We experience God sometimes as creator, which I don't believe in. We experience God as kind of sanctifier, as a kind of holding us up. So we experience, the redemptive power of God. So there are many ways in which we experience God. And these are all masks. And it's not so much that God is wearing these masks, is that we are imposing these masks on God to try to make sense of the experiences we're having of God. So when prosopon gets translated into Latin, it's translated as persona. And persona is the Latin word for a mask. Per means through, and sona means to sound. So you got a mask with a hole in it. You sound through it. So that's persona. You got two holes for your eyes. And then we got the word person from that. And we got the word personality from that. And all it means is really, it's a mask. It's a mask we impose on God in order to try to make sense of the experiences that we're having of her. So that's the God that I do not believe in. So now we got this tug of war going on between religion, and mysticism. And basically, I believe that religion, it's necessary because it creates community, and it should afford us ritual that allow us to change our states of consciousness and therefore experience mysticism. But religion is merely the training wheels for spirituality. We have to outgrow mere religion. I'm not saying abandon it, has its uses, but we have to outgrow it and realize if it's not allowing us to have personal Gnostic experiences, it's actually holding us back. But it's the training wheels for the mystical understanding. Now, unfortunately, religions kind of migrate into fundamentalist thinking again and again and again. And so when it migrates into fundamentalism, then our relationship with God becomes based on fear instead of love. Our relationship with the other members of our community is based on law and dogma rather than on love. And our relationship with others outside the system is based on prejudice and xenophobia instead of love. And so in some senses, fundamentalism is the antithesis of mysticism. And when I look at fundamentalism, and it's not just true of religion, it's true in politics, it's true in businesses of various kinds, it's true of the pharmaceutical model, the medical model, the educational model, they all fall into this trap. And the 4 steps of fundamentalism are these. The first step is you reduce very complex ideas like God to a few one-liners, something a bumper sticker, and you think you can kind of capture God in a bumper sticker on your car. So the first step is you have to reduce really complex ideas to one-liners that even the dumbest of us can understand. Stage 2 is now you have to identify or fabricate an enemy figure, somebody who doesn't believe what you believe. The third stage is you have to dehumanize the other party. They're not even human beings anymore. And so even the words we use to kind of describe them are diminishing of them. And then step 4 is, if we're in the position to do it, there's the slaughter begins. Sometimes there's verbal slaughter, and ultimately it's military slaughter. So that's what fundamentalism looks like in its 4 stages of its evolution. Now, mysticism does exactly the opposite. It goes in exactly the opposite direction. Firstly, it moves from cataphatic to apophatic language. Instead of being simplistic language, it becomes more and more complex language. It's going the opposite direction. Secondly, it begins to realize that all people are my neighbor. There is no enemy figure. The third stage is said, instead of dehumanizing them, I say, namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And then the fourth stage, finally, instead of war, we reach out in unconditional love. And so today, my brothers and sisters, wherever you are listening to this or seeing this, namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you.